Welcome to the ACT podcast. As usual, I'm Lizzie Harewood, and in this episode in our series of Teaching Christianly, we are thinking about RE, religious education, its purpose, its value, how we can approach it as Christian educators. And we are joined today by ACT's very own Cristo Rodriguez, who is an RE specialist and a trustee, and also Savvas Costi, who is also an RE teacher. Tell us a little bit about what you do, Sav. What's your role?
Yeah, so I'm currently teaching religion and philosophy at a school down in Hove, and I've just completed my first year there. And prior to that, I spent some time working in as a head of department at an independent school, not too far away from Hove, over in East Sussex. And I also had some time up in Watford, which is where I actually did my what was known as the NQT year back in the day. It's not called that anymore.
Yeah,
And I was there for 6 years. So that's kind of an overview of where I've been teaching. I've taught in a few other places as well. I had some time in a couple of Catholic schools as well. But in terms of the places where I spent the lion's share of my time, I'd say Watford, the independent school at Bede's, and where I'm based at the moment in Hove, have been I think, quite significant shapers in
brilliant.
terms of my experience. So yeah, that's where I've come from.
And Christo, just for the benefit of our listeners who may not know what your role is in the RE world, just give us a bit of an update on what you do.
Thanks, Lizzie, and thanks, Sav. Yeah, I've had different roles in education over the years. Been involved in teaching French and German, but currently working with the Multi-Academy Trust as a subject leader in religious education. And then I have another part-time job with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, working with them to develop conferences and events in the education space as well.
Excellent. So we've got two really valuable voices here. And I must say, at ACT, I think a while ago, maybe sort of 20 odd years ago, ACT would have been full of RE teachers. And perhaps that's not a surprise. Now, the context, the academic subject is quite different now in terms of who populates. I'm sure there are still many Christian educators who teach RE and those that are kind of brought in to teach RE. But as I'm sure we'll discover during the course of our discussion, RE is going through some real challenges. And perhaps nowadays we don't have as many Christians who kind of go into RE teaching as a real vocation. So I hope that this benefits those that are Christians and are RE specialists, maybe those that are reluctant non-specialists but are firm Christians, or someone who's just passionate about teaching the truth about religion and theology and philosophy in schools. So, yeah, let's kick off. Chris, I'm going to hand over to you to give us our first sort of topic.
Great, thank you, and thanks again for being with us, Sav. You know, I'm really interested in your journey into RE. You hinted at that a little bit in your kind of introduction, but how did you get into RE? What are some of the experiences or approaches that have kind of shaped your vision for RE in terms of your practice and your teaching?
Yeah, for me personally, it probably goes right the way back to my experiences when I was at school myself. So I was fortunate enough to have an overall positive experience growing up at the school that I went to in Kingsbury. And because I know that that's not always the case for everyone. And I think if you come out of that setting, with a negative experience, it makes you much less likely then to want to go back into it. So I was fortunate both my primary and secondary school years generally were quite happy years. So that was the first thing. And when I finished my undergraduate studies, I studied theology at the London School of Theology and was unsure or exploring what options I might want to do later. And I remember at that time we had a couple of people who'd graduated who went on actually to do a PGCE. And specifically, they went off to study at King's College in London. And I was hearing lots of positive things about that. And some of the lecturers at the time were saying people who'd left at LST and went on to do teacher training at PGC, then went on to do quite well. So I took that seriously. So I thought, okay, maybe. But I was still unsure as to whether I wanted to go into teaching. So to help um, just explore this further, I actually went into being a TA for a year with the view to then just saying, is this really what I want to pursue as a career? And I actually secured that at Watford Boys, which was the first school I then went on to go and to teach. But obviously, it ticked all the right boxes. I enjoyed being a TA. I enjoyed being back into sort of that education setup with the kids, and just went from there really. So once I completed my PGC at King's, it was trained under a critical realist pedagogy, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about later. It's remained foundational, I think, very much to how I approach teaching throughout my career. Um, but that was all of those experiences combined sort of nudged me in the direction of teaching and to teach sort of under the guise of critical realism, as it were. And then I also think that my first school setup, I think for any teacher, in many ways, the first place that you go to where you do your training, it leaves its imprint on you. It's quite formative. I hear some people saying, is that like the default in which you fall back to as a teacher? Because every school, I think, has got its unique culture and its unique setup. But I think the fact that I completed my NQTU in a school setting, which at the time was quite high achieving, was quite an academic school, quite big on striving towards academic excellence and success. That sort of left an imprint which I've carried with me, I think, into all the school settings that I've been into. So that's kind of been my journey over the years.
And why,
Thanks.
Sav, did you want to teach RE? Because again, as I'm sure we'll talk about, there seems to be a bit of a crisis in the subject for various reasons, and the quality of the provision, shortage of teachers. Why do you think RE is an important subject to teach as an academic discipline, but also from a Christian perspective, understanding kind of the basic teachings of Christianity and other religions?
Sure. So, I mean, at the time, I remember I was thinking of how I could best utilize the degree that I'd been studying, and also what was a subject that doesn't just focus on what we're doing in the classroom, but extends beyond that. So, RE was always like that philosophy, theology. You're not just studying something for the sake of learning to pass an exam and to fill your head with knowledge. It was always meant to be quite practical. It was meant to make a difference to how we lived our lives. From the moment you exit the classroom, the choices we make, that it was a very hands-on practical subject. And that was how philosophy was always understood when we talk about ancient philosophy as well. And I think theology has been like that as well. So I saw RE as being like that as well. And given the makeup of the world that we're in, that it has moved towards becoming increasingly more multicultural and diverse, um, it was quite obvious to me to see that actually if we're going to make progress in terms of how we can learn to get on with one another and to better understand each other, you need to give the formal space for people to be able to explore these very fundamental questions and these beliefs and ideas.
Mm.
So I recognize I always saw it as having a crucial place on the curriculum. And I think anyone, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not, I think that should be a project that we could all subscribe to, that if we're wanting to learn how to better coexist with one another, we want to create the formal space for being able to do that within the classroom. And this is kind of what RE is meant to be all about, that we're allowing the students the space to be able to do that in a way that's thoughtful, that's done in the right way with depth as well, to be able to study these ideas properly. So all of those things led me to want to be able to teach that. And it's also very exciting as well, I think, when you're talking about controversial topics. I remember hearing someone say that controversy was the lifeblood of RE. And there's been a shift in that in recent times, because we have to think very carefully about how we manage controversy. But kids love it. They love having the opportunity to have those debates, as long as it's done in a spirit of respect, and you're doing it in a manner that you're not trying to coerce other people to think what you think. You're giving people the freedom to believe what they like in a classical liberal sense, as I would
Yeah.
define it. The kids would really, really enjoy it. And it's great to see them develop that confidence as well with speaking out, and to be able to formulate their ideas and to be able to put it all in writing. These are skills that they're transferable into so many different career choices. And so for me, it was quite a smooth and easy transition to make. I thought, this is a really important subject. It's great preparation for kids, to get through school and also to go on to do so many different things later on.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of how I got drawn into it.
Sav, can I ask you a bit of a follow-up on that? You mentioned sort of your motivation, your background. How important do you think it is for a school um, to have sort of a clear vision behind what RE is for? And then maybe can you speak a bit more to what you think the value of RE is in terms of what's intrinsic, what are they getting out of RE, and for sort of in that space of being in school, and then the extrinsic value of RE, maybe related to
Sure.
the subjects or bigger,
Yeah,
wider
I think
experience.
sure. I think yeah, in terms of understanding the purpose of RE, it certainly helps if we have a common understanding. But I think the reality has been that that hasn't always been the case. That there's that shared
Mm,
understanding amongst staff, amongst colleagues, amongst
mm,
SLT, even amongst parents. And RE, I think, has the hardest sell of all the subjects because if you're trying to sell history, you know what you're signing up for. If you try to sell science, you've got a fairly good idea what you're going to go on to study and what that might lead to. But I think because the nature of RE and how it's seems to have evolved and shifted over the last few decades, and parents' experiences of what RE was like isn't necessarily the same as what it is at the moment. And that can also go with regards to perceptions at management level as well. So having a common understanding, I think, is really important. And this is part of the challenge, I think, as RE practitioners, is there's more of an onus, I think, perhaps for us to articulate that vision and to communicate it to all the various different spheres within the school community, colleagues, students, parents. So that's a factor. Pedagogy probably isn't talked about enough in schools. We do talk about it, but not enough. And probably the main reason behind that, from my experience, is that we're just so busy. So you have to be quite intentional and deliberate, and to create the space for people to thoughtfully reflect on their practice in a hyperactive environment like a school. And many teachers who listen to this, I'm sure, will know exactly what this is like. This is really hard. It's really hard to do that. So, but it is important. I think we should keep that, especially for a subject like RE, where there's been a number of pedagogies with regards to how we approach it. It's important to discuss it. Um, as I teach it, obviously, I see it as we're looking to develop the usual skills, not just in RE, this happens in other subjects as well. But, we're looking at how we develop students' ability to think critically, to do speaking, to write well. So obviously that's a key part of it. But obviously boosting religious literacy is a key marker of
mm-hmm.
critical realism as well. That was one of the things that drew me to King's, is that it took the teaching of religion quite seriously and to enable students to talk intelligently about religion. I think that's so important today. Um, when we look at some of the data that's been coming out, so you look at the Pew Research Center, and it says that the general forecasts are Christianity, the numbers globally aren't going to decline, they're going to stay as they are, and Islam is the fastest growing religion. And I've always argued that from the point of view of, if you're going to have to study religion in the curriculum, and this is part of the decision we've made at GCSE level, Christianity and Islam would seem to be the two main religions to go to. They are the two most popular religions, I think, whenever I attend AQA exam meetings. And for GCSE level, you can only pick two religions, and it's often Christianity and Islam. It's not always, it's going to vary depending on the setup that you're in. And I think that's understandable if you're in a community where you've got lots of Hindus or Jews, and you might choose to opt for those religions. But I think probably as a general norm, it's we've been heavily shaped by Christianity as a nation in the West. A lot of our values have come out of Christian roots. Tom Holland has done a lot of work on this. If you read his Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, if that's too big for anyone, Glenn Scrivener has written a fantastic book, The Air We Breathe, much more short and much more accessible. And when we think about the fact that we're not like how we used to be in the ancient world, this is Tom Holland's journey when he reflected on, we look at the ancient world and it was cruel and it was barbaric and they did some pretty horrendous things back then. How do we get from where we were back then to having the
mm,
values that have just gone mainstream today? Classic example, we all believe in the value of equality, and we think, well, what brought us to a point where we saw racism as being problematic, we see sexism as being problematic, because these were not ideas that were prevalent in the ancient world. So I think the Christian Revolution, and if anyone wants to know more about this, I'd highly recommend reading Tom Holland and Glenn Scrivener on this. It helps us to make sense of how we got to be where we are today, and I think that makes a very strong argument for saying Christianity should still occupy an important place in the curriculum, regardless of whether you're Christian or not, to try and to recognize that and to see, how can we preserve some of these values that we've had all these years. And some are arguing now that we're at risk perhaps of losing some of those values as we move further away from our Christian roots. So there's that. And then Islam is quite an obvious choice as well. If we've been shaped by Christianity and if Islam continues to grow in the way that it has done, and the influence of Islam is going to grow, of course, we should have space to explore those two religions. I think in the curriculum. So, but boosting religious literacy, of course, hugely, hugely important. I'd also say education as virtue formation
Mm.
is really, really important. That we're not just looking to get bums on seats. We're not just looking to have students pass their exams. Important as those things are, I get as head of department, you live or die by your results and your recruitment. But ultimately, we're wanting to not just develop students for a career later. We want them to develop for life in the working world, in real life. And I think developing their character is really, really important. And RE can play a really important role in that area as well. There's been a lot of research as well. A book that I read when I recently started as head of department, which was really influential in terms of how I approach teaching, was The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. It's an excellent read. I think the title is slightly misleading because when it says The Coddling of the American Mind, some people look at it and go, oh, this is just American. I think they probably should have labeled it The Coddling of the Western Mind. And there's much within that book that he's looking at research not just in America, he's looking at the context in Europe and the UK and Australia. So there's a lot, I think, all practitioners, there's a lot that we could learn from that book. And there was a proverb that he teased out there, which was, you prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. And it was all about our approach to education is we're meant to be preparing children, students for what it's going to be like when they leave the educational institution, be it school, university, whatever. And I think we're doing students a disservice if we don't do that. And sometimes we don't always get that right, or we lose perspective because we're so busy with things. We can become bogged down with we just want to get them through their exams. I think it's important, and RE has a key role to play in this as well, where good RE, whereby we're trying to develop and nurture students to become better people. I think teachers who
Can
take
I
that seriously, I think
can
we'll
I
go.
backtrack us just a little bit? Because even though many of our listeners may be RE teachers, I imagine there'll be a significant number who aren't RE teachers or are sometimes kind of, co-opted into the RE classroom.
Yeah.
Maybe Cristo, you'd be the best person to explain what the kind of frameworks are for teaching RE in the UK, um, locally, nationally, because RE as an academic subject falls kind of outside of normal curriculum boundaries, doesn't it? It's not technically part of the national, well, it has different determinations depending on where you are, what kind of school you're in. So could you give us a bit of an overview there?
Yeah, obviously that's a kind of a question that has kind of historical import as well. We've moved from what people might critique as a religious indoctrination
Mm.
way of teaching RE, moving on to sort of a phenomenological approach of the phenomenon of religious belief, and trying to kind of cram in as many world religions as possible. That paradigm seems to be very much creaking. Obviously, on the national level, it doesn't have a national curriculum, and
Mm.
so local agreed syllabi are put forth through SACREs and locally agreed syllabus conferences. And so schools creating their own curriculum, as it were, will sometimes have expert providers bought in to create the curriculum. Sometimes they'll use the locally agreed syllabus, some of which are very good. And obviously, there's lots of discussions going on at the moment. I think for me, just to kind of add my vision for RE, which is very much in line with Savvas, is the idea of knowledge in RE. And I think this comes to our kind of historical point. A lot of people view RE as kind of, it's about opinions. It's, there's no right or wrong in RE. And I think, there's been a couple of articles that stood out to me that use the term epistemic injustice, that actually when we see RE as this kind of place of opinion sharing and there's no right or wrong, then actually it really downgrades RE. So I don't think
I hate the
that's
phrase.
a helpful vision for RE. I think that's probably a misconception of what RE is. I think there's been a lot of work done in the past decade to re-establish RE as a knowledge-rich academic subject. And I think the other dynamic to say is, personal development often gets confused with RE, and in some corners of the sector, people sort of use religious education to achieve personal development goals. But in the education inspection framework, RE is an academic subject and is to be kind of viewed and judged on its own terms with its own value. So there's a lot more to say there. I'm sure Sav will want to jump in, but
Sure.
Oh
I
yeah,
think, yeah, I mean,
that
I
was
go for it, Sav. Go on.
Yeah, I don't like the phrase that there's no right or wrong answers. I think the knowledge-rich approach is so important. I remember a few years ago at the ISRSA conference, we had Portia Berry Kilby did a brilliant talk on the importance of the freedom of religious belief, sort of generally. But the way she pitched her talk, I said to her, I thought that was fantastic as a plug for why the subject is so important. And one of the phrases she came out with was a little learning is a dangerous thing, because when we have a superficial understanding of religion, that tends not to lead towards respectful dialogue with one another. So there's a need for depth here, and yeah, part of the challenge as well with RE historically has been this view that non-specialists can teach the subject. And I can understand in some settings that's just the way it goes. And if you've got someone who's a really well-experienced teacher, they could perhaps make the shift over towards the subject. I came to a point personally when I was head of department where I said, unless someone's got a degree in RS, theology, philosophy, I don't want them to teach the subject, because that depth of knowledge, that expertise is so important, especially for a subject like this, where you're dealing with so many misconceptions out there. And in order to do it effectively, I think there needs to be some measure of depth. Now that is challenging, and this is partly why some people get put off by critical realism, is it asks quite a lot. And that's not a finished journey by any means. I think we've all got areas to develop. I try to keep up a regular habit of reading, and I think there are some aspects of philosophy and religion. If it's Christian theology, I know quite a lot about that. Islam theology, I'm obviously very much open to continuously know more about that, because that's not been my background. We've always got areas to improve upon that, but that's quite important as practitioners, teachers. It asks a lot of us to be able to, if you're not a specialist, to be able to do the reading or to listen to podcasts. There's lots of information out there to try and ensure that we do know what we're talking about, and that goes beyond just the level of what we read in the textbooks. And at the same time, then we're able to transfer that over, and we're trying to instill a love of curiosity amongst our students. We want them to go away and to be readers themselves, to go away and to think a bit more carefully about this stuff, not just what's going on in the classroom, but again, with the sheer plethora of information we've got out there at the moment. I think Cristo made a really important point there. The superficial understanding, I actually think, does more harm to the subject than
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. What do you mean by superficial understanding? Because I suppose you mentioned critical realism,
Yeah.
and I'm just intrigued as to what could be an example of harmful practice. Just so we
I
can,
don't like the idea of saying there's no right or wrong answer. And this is like part of the tenets of critical realism. We're going to come on to this. It takes the pursuit of truth very seriously. And the other thing is, from a recruitment point of view, if I want to recruit my students, particularly those with the more science or maths brain, they're wanting a clear answer. And to just say to someone like that, there is, right, I get the sentiment behind that is that there isn't a fixed answer. Okay, that's true. There are many answers that are given here, and we're open to exploring these. And we're not going to present you with a fixed answer as if to go, this is the right answer.
Mm.
I tend to play the role as the facilitator when students ask me what I think in the classroom. And my default answer is, who cares what Mr. Crosty thinks? Because I want them to think it through for themselves. But where the pursuit of truth matters, and there are many answers, and some answers are arguably closer to the truth than others. Critical realism takes the realism part seriously, that there's a world out there to be explored, to discover, that we can know something about the real world. Even though our experiences and our knowledge is impartial and subject to revision and incomplete, fine, but we can know something about the world out there as well. And we're encouraging students to make those judgments as well, which is part and parcel with how our exams are all set up as well. That you take the evaluation questions. If students aren't making rational judgments, they're going to lose marks. They can't sit on the fence. So it's built into many of the exam courses that we do, that we want students to explore the different views that are out there and to argue for a case. And okay, some students, they might find it easier to just argue as if God exists, even if they think God doesn't exist. But a better way forward is to try to encourage them to think carefully about these questions and to reach either there is a God or there isn't. One of those has to be true. You can't say that those are both true. And to encourage them to explore that and to come to a decision. And it's okay to sit there and to go, well, we can't both be right on that. Like in terms of philosophical precision and accuracy, one of these has got to be right. And that's another one of the areas I think that attracts me very much to critical realism, is it takes that aspect seriously. So I often say there are many answers. We're encouraging students to find out these answers for themselves and to reach these conclusions. But you can't just say that there's no right or wrong answer in this. Jesus did rise from the dead, or he didn't. Which is it? Jesus is God in the flesh, or is he just a prophet, or was he an imposter? You can't just say, from a speaking in terms of coherency and congruence, those can't all be true. One of those has got to be right. So yeah, I would say, as part of having a deep dive into this subject, to do that as well, you're going to need to go deep with the text as well, with the reading. And again, that's been made incredibly more challenging, I'd say, probably in the last 5, 6 years. The pandemic didn't help. The rise in social media as well. So the school that I'm in, they've recently just appointed a new literacy lead. There seems to be that's growing in many schools because the general levels of literacy is in decline nationally. That makes doing what I'm doing much more harder, because if you're wanting to talk about deep thinking and grappling with text and reading, it's becoming much harder to do that. So, and I understand that as well. I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing, as education, generally as teachers.
Yeah.
But I still think that just because something is challenging, that doesn't mean to say we should dismiss it or we can't do it. I think it's good to have this as one of our aims if we're serious about preserving the integrity of the subject. If we want to take high quality RE seriously, then this is part and parcel of it. And if you get the right students involved in this, it really is a success. It goes really well, and they love it as well, I think. And it's great preparation for them as well, as they then go on to leave school to do other things.
So you've talked about critical realism, and it sounds like a really valuable sort of methodology. Um, Forgive me if that's not the correct term. Cristo, what about you? How do you approach the planning and teaching of RE?
Um, Something I've been influenced by is the idea of different kinds of knowledge in RE, substantive and disciplinary knowledge. And so, as well as knowing lots of useful information about different religious traditions and non-religious traditions that might be quite well accepted, almost sort of bits of knowledge that we might consider this is a substantive factual information of RE. We've also got the disciplines of RE, and that's the rules and tools of thinking by which we arrive at that substantive knowledge. And broadly speaking, I can see the subject of RE to be a composite subject, just like science has biology, chemistry, and physics, and these are complementary disciplines. They articulate different aspects of knowledge in science. They have different rules and tools of arriving at them. They describe sort of different realities, if you like. And I think in RE, we're best placed to understand knowledge in RE through the disciplines of theology, philosophy, history, and also human sciences. So creating a curriculum that does justice to and takes heed of the way that knowledge claims are made in those disciplines, I think actually unpicks a lot of this issue around, there's no right or wrong answer. And just to tie that into the previous conversation, I think the purpose of RE in a school does a lot to predict or influence how RE happens in the school. So if you see RE as primarily, not secondarily or in a tertiary way, but primarily about social cohesion, and the social cohesion is wagging RE, if you like, it's the driving factor. Then ideas of there's no right or wrong, all religions and religious truth claims and non-religious truth claims are equal, is going to be something that's going to influence your epistemology or way of knowing in RE. So it's just an example of how the purpose of the subject deeply influences that. And so recovering from that kind of hazy thinking RE, you would say, well, the discipline of sociology would just describe what people believe. And in that sense, it's not necessarily making a judgment whether those beliefs are quote unquote right or wrong. But to Sav's point, the discipline of philosophy would say you can't both believe A and B when B and A are in complete polar opposition to each other, because they're mutually exclusive. So one would want to apply the disciplines of RE so that you can make careful statements about truth and falsehood that are relative to those disciplines. And I think that's really very rigorous. It's an academic approach. It connects them with traditions of thinking in the universities. and avoid some of these pitfalls of kind of hazy, muddled thinking in RE. So for me, it's all about the disciplines alongside that substantive content.
Mm. So in terms of you kind of inferred or you referenced some of the hazy thinking, and it'd be very difficult for us to talk about RE without some of the problems that we are seeing at a national level. The problem with, persistent lack of qualified teachers, with schools that are perhaps sometimes breaking the law, in terms of not teaching it, in terms of RE as a subject being downgraded and not included in the EBAC. Um, and with problems of funding and all kinds of issues. But there's also a wider discussion about the framing of the subject and about the kind of RE that we want to be bringing forwards to schools for the next generation. So either of you really, what would you say are some of the important discussions going on? What is the way forward for RE at a national level, and what are some of the strengths and drawbacks of different approaches that you nodded to?
Does Cristo want to go? Shall I go? Okay. A few things are going through my mind when I heard what Cristo just said there. That was really, really helpful and lots
Mm.
of really good things there. But a word should be said about the place of controversy as well, because I don't think as a society um, we don't cope with engaging with controversial topics particularly well, and
Yeah.
we're seeing it poorly modeled as well. When we look at our politicians when they have disagreement, it's awful. Social media is not the space to have this sort of discussion. I think that's another reason, when we talk about the issues around hazy thinking, I think if you're going to have a helpful discussion, you're going to need to do it in a way that's right with, precision, with precise thinking as well. So it's important that I make that point, I think, before we move on. So yeah, in terms of what's going on nationally. I mean, at the time of the recording, there's currently a curriculum review taking place with our government. So RE is undergoing renewed scrutiny, as it does seem to do periodically after every few years. So I know that within the ISRSA and the REN, these are two networks that I'm involved in. They've submitted a joint proposal to the Department of Education outlining what is a national framework for RS that's rooted in theology, philosophy, and the academic study of religion. The aim being to ensure that RE in schools is rigorous, coherent, aligned with the disciplines represented at university level as well. So, much of what we've been talking about to preserve high quality RE, I like that document. That's a really good document that I'd encourage all my listeners, if you haven't yet seen it, do check that out. It's not too long. You can go onto the REN or the ISRSA website, or we'll put. I'm sure when this goes onto the website, there'll be like a link to that document. We can include
Yeah.
that as part
Yeah.
of this. What I like about that proposal, there's three things that strike me. Is it does take character formation seriously. It takes the pursuit of truth seriously as well, and to manage that in a way that's helpful. And it takes critical engagement. And I notice as well with how RE has been taught, and this is something that I think a lot of teachers might default to, especially if they're not specialists. When I read Philip Barnes's book, which book was it? It was Education, Diversity.
Was it the
Uh,
triumph? It wasn't the triumph of the secular.
no, it wasn't that
It
one.
was
There
a
was another book that
different.
he read. Oh, I need to double check that. He wrote a book, but in it he documents some research. Um, and for many teachers, they didn't even include a critical component to when they were teaching the subject,
Yeah.
which is understandable. If you're not specialist, you might be thinking you want to shy away from any exploration of questions of truth and saying that anything is right or wrong at all. So you just say this is what people believe and leave it at that, which I don't think is the kids want to have. If you've got a room filled with different views of thinking, they want to have that opportunity, and I think it's a real shame if you're not giving them that space to be able to do that. So I like that all of those things are embedded as part of the proposal.
Mm.
There have been issues around worldviews. We're gonna talk about that at some point. So again, it's important to keep the context behind this, and I think much of the intentions and aims, we're all in agreement. We care about the importance of the subject. We want high quality RE for our kids. We had the curriculum reforms in 2016. which up until that point, RS, RE was the fastest growing humanities subject. You know, A-level numbers, I remember seeing graphs. If you look at what the A-level numbers were like when I was at school in the late 90s compared to what it was like up until 2016, it's like the numbers had doubled. It just shot up. So the numbers were looking really, really good. Then the curriculum reforms happened. You know, people stopped offering the subject as an AS. It was omitted from the EBAC, and numbers basically plummeted as a result. And the commission came out, I think, was it 2018? Cristo will be able to correct me. I think it was 2018 when that came out. And they were talking then about, you know, the subject's not in a healthy state, numbers seem to be in decline. There needs to be something has to change here. That's kind of the argument that was given. There needed to be a paradigm shift. And what was presented was worldviews was going to be the way to help take the subject forward. Um, Again, cutting a long story short, there have been concerns that a number of us have raised around how the proposal, as it was being presented, it was done in a manner as if to say there was complete unanimous agreement within the RE world. That wasn't the case. And some of us were expressing our concerns and criticisms with regards to this. And one of the things that I think has been quite sad is how where this was initially an attempt to unite the RE world and to help improve the status of the subject nationally, because we all care about the same thing. We all want high quality RE for our kids. The reality actually seems to have been is it's created a schism. You've got those who are proponents of the worldviews agenda who support it, and then you've got those who are critical and aren't on board with it. And the as I see it within the RE world, we seem to have divided at a time when we needed to come together, and you know we're wanting to help build up our departments and to help take the subject forward. And some of those concerns I would see as they could compromise the integrity of the subject. You know, issues around definitions of worldviews being too vague. There was a really good book that I read recently by a guy called Simon Kennedy, called Against Worldview. He's an Australian academic, and I've just pulled out his definition of worldview here. He says the worldview concept has very little content and almost no philosophical precision. Worldview, it seems, is a conceptual wax nose that can be changed to fit the circumstances and needs of the person wielding it. And these were some of the concerns that we were flagging up and raising with the worldviews agenda. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily fair to say of all the proponents of the worldviews agenda. I think that the part of the challenge here is there's lots of stakeholders, lots of key players in this thing. And I'm going to draw attention to, I think, the work of, it was Trevor Cooling, one of his articles that he wrote for the British Journal of Religious Education, which I'd encourage people to go away and read. It was entitled Knowledge in a Religion and Worldviews Approach in English Schools. It came out in January 2024, and maybe we can share the link as well. When I read through that article, I know Trevor Cooling had written it partly in response to some of the writings of Andrew Wright. Andrew and Eleanor Wright wrote a piece for the British Journal of Religious Education as well, basically, you know, pushing forward a critical realist pedagogy and how more of that needed to have been included as part of the whole worldviews proposal. And when you read Trevor Cooling's article there, it sounds like he's done that. He's trying to include much more of critical realism in what he's doing. And he's citing a lot of academics that I would say I'm very much in agreement with as well. He cites the likes of, you know, Charles Taylor's Social Imaginary or Esther Lightcap Meek. And she's done a lot of work, you know, having been influenced by Polanyi, around different ways of knowing. And that's kind of what it sounds like that's what Trevor Cooling was shooting for when he proposed worldviews, his whole idea there. I've been in inset sessions remotely with Trevor, and I've heard him say himself that he'd be willing to drop the worldviews label, but for whatever reason that hasn't happened. And personally, when I see that, some of us are concerned that are there other players involved in this with the intention to try and secularize the curriculum? It's been attempted before. Is it happening again? Some of us are suspicious. I've been suspicious in this process, and I think, you know, this is probably that's the first opportunity that I can publicly say this. We did have there was a meeting in Harrow a few years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, where Julie Arliss and various others they had a meeting with Trevor Cooling and other people. They sat around the table to talk about this. I couldn't make it. There was a reason, I can't remember what it was, but for whatever reason, I wasn't able to make that. And in retrospect, part of me really wishes I had made that. I would have been able to sit down with Trevor Cooling. We could have talked about this. That never happened. But I certainly think that as it stands at the moment, not enough has been done to alleviate those concerns. And although they may well have the best intentions to preserve the subject, to take it forward, we're in agreement on that. That's what we all want. I don't think that the proposals as they are at the moment with the worldview stuff, I don't think it will do justice to the subject. In fact, if anything, I think it will be counterproductive and risk weakening it even further. I think those are some of the concerns that we have there. When you read
Krista,
Philip Barnes's book, Religion and Worldviews, the chapter, there was a chapter on there. Hang on, let me just find where this was. Uh, Sorry. Yes, it was the Anthony Coe's chapter, A View from the Inside. And I didn't like the treatment that he got, as he was somebody who was involved in the proposals as they were coming up, and he had a critical voice, and just the treatment he got was horrendous. I think, when you have disagreement, there are better ways of managing that, and I don't think that some of the tactics that have been deployed from those in the worldviews camp have up to this point been particularly helpful, certainly to alleviate some of the concerns that we have. And so what seems to have happened is we've just gone our separate ways, and we've got the REN now that's advocating for high quality RE and wanting to keep religion as a key part of what we're doing to preserve its integrity, whilst those in the worldviews camp are doing their thing, as it were.
Krista, I wonder, could you perhaps articulate a little bit more about what this paradigm shift means according to those that proposed it? Because I suppose, as a Christian, I'm a non-specialist. The idea of teaching something along the lines of worldview, in that I presume, that everyone has a worldview and that we can analyze and evaluate the legitimacy of our own worldview. We can almost come outside ourselves and realize that we are not just we don't just receive information sort of and then make our minds up without some kind of bias. There's something that helps to pivot our thinking, maybe the experiences or our culture. I mean, what does it mean? It feels like it could be quite a helpful paradigm, but what actually is the meat of it?
Well, I think, I'm going to go back to see where worldview sits relative to the disciplines of RE, and and then the second point I would say is it's an issue of scale. Does worldview have the capability to be a paradigm?
Mm,
So you could have the view that worldview is a concept within religious education. And I think, to your point, Lizzie, that could be really helpful, really valuable. It's a conceptual tool to sort of say, look, this is how kind of abstract truth relates to individuals. So philosophy and theology, how it relates to sociology or anthropology. We have worldviews, we live worldviews, we inhabit worldviews. And that's sort of seeing as a useful conceptual tool within the framework of religious education. I think to the scale point, and then I'll return to the disciplines point. The scale point is that paradigm of worldview the meta narrative, the meta lens that we want to rename the subject of religious education to in the UK, and that's a question that I think Savvas is getting at. Is it sufficiently defined? Is it sufficiently delimited in terms of what it's not? And I think in some of the early work, and to be fair, the worldview papers, they were saying things we might begin to map out what worldview might mean. And so that was the worldview papers published after the core report in 2018. We might only be able to map out now what it might mean. And so, to Sav's point, there is a lack of coherence to what it would mean for it to be a paradigm for a subject. But I think there is utility in it as a concept within a subject. So that's the scale issue. It's a
mm,
question as to whether it can bear what it means to be a subject in school. Then, to relate it to the disciplines, from my reading of the literature in religion and worldviews, worldview becomes the locus of study. It becomes the object of study, and so worldviews, kind of promote and focus on individuals with worldviews. And so, to me, worldviews, as expressed in the literature, belongs a bit more towards the sociology of religion. We're studying people's worldviews,
okay.
and if that
You're
becomes
starting with a person.
often, I mean, yeah, you see in the literature
Mm,
examples of people and their lived worldviews, and students study not necessarily the core of theological belief within a tradition. And a lot of the worldviews crowd would say, they want to be anti-essentialist and kind of get away, which I agree with. And so one way that they do that is by looking at kind of examples of lived worldviews. And some of these are quite niche. One we've talked about is, studying I think it's an Anglican man that has an interest in Celtic Christianity, that's married to a pagan that's looking at incorporating pagan festivals into his life. So there's lots of plates spinning at one time. It's very much a sociological study of people. And to just bring it back to those four disciplines, what's the place of theology? What's the place of philosophy? I think the worldviews approach wants to emphasize probably sociology more than the other disciplines, and it's a case of needing kind of balance in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get everything that Cristo said there. I don't know, Lizzie, if you heard.
Yeah, no, I wonder whether would you be able to just repeat that last sort of
Sorry.
sentence you said? Because you're cutting in and out occasionally.
Apologies. Yeah. So I think to this to the sort of point of the disciplines,
Yeah,
the focus of the study on worldviews places it more within the discipline of sociology, which might be
yeah.
welcomed in some quarters. And I'm not saying sociology is not an unimportant discipline, but one has to decide, you have these disciplines, what is the primary discipline of RE? How do they complement each other? And I think worldviews needs more work around what would it mean for worldviews to be the meta paradigm, and the meta lens.
Sure. And what are we seeing? So I'm aware that there are already resources and there are already um, uh, sacros that are adopting this kind of paradigm or essentially a worldviews curriculum. What are we seeing some of those resources and why should we, not just as RE academics, or I'm not an RE, I'm not an academic, but why, as Christians, should we be concerned alongside perhaps having that academic concern?
So because I could think some people are going to hear this and they're going to want something a bit more specific as to what have we seen that's giving you cause for concern with the whole worldview stuff. So I looked at, and again we can share the links here. I looked at the worldviews framework from RE Online, and this was a document that was produced by Gillian Giorgio. I found two things that came out of that document that I found to be a cause for concern. So firstly was, and we've alluded to this, the fact that worldviews start with people.
Mm.
And I get that's all very good. We want to meet people where they're at, and that's a key part of what we're doing. But there can be concerns around there if we stay there that we just reduce what we're doing to just mere subjectivity, that it's just about the level of beliefs. It just becomes sociological, and that's not what RE is meant to be. Um, Calvin famously said that true knowledge of the self was closely related to true knowledge of God, and that the two were joined by many bonds. So, you think about the discipline of theology, the study of God. Yeah, we can start with where we're at, but at the same time, isn't there meant to be an element of going beyond ourselves and looking out to God? And that's again within a critical realist framework, you want to keep both positions in hand. So you don't want to reduce it to just mere subjectivity. These are all just ideas in the head, and that's one of the concerns I have with the worldviews proposal as it is. People are free to hold that view, but you want to preserve the dignity of difference. You don't want to be patronizing of people who are coming from these religious traditions who they're not saying it's we start with worldviews, we start with God. And
Mm.
that's one of the concerns that I have. And there's the second thing as well. In the key findings section by in Gillian Giorgio's document, it said to focus on context, avoid abstraction and essentialism. Avoid
Mm.
abstraction and essentialism. Okay, we're all for avoiding abstraction. We're trying to make things concrete and accessible so that the kids can understand what we're doing. Absolutely. If we're going to get rid of essentialism, what's the alternative to that? Isn't that existentialism? That's an existentialist philosophy. That sounds like Jean-Paul Sartre and the secular turn. And that's kind of where our concerns are coming from. If you're going to completely shun all essentialized views of religion, You
Mm.
think of discrete religious traditions. That was Andrew Wright's term. When I asked him about what he meant by that, he said he'd forgotten. But there's a body of data. There's key teachings that have been handed down and passed on through the generations. We go right to the New Testament when in 2 Timothy 1:14, Timothy is instructed to guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you. And there's a body of knowledge that's being passed down. We think of the historic creeds. There's another
Mm.
fantastic book that has recently come out by Sarah Irving Stonebreak. It's called Priests of History. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with the worldview stuff is just symptomatic of being in an ahistoric age, that we've forgotten much of the history that's gone before. And again, that's one of the disciplines that Cristo is referring to. We are, we're teaching already, but history is playing a key part of what we're doing as well. I'm not entirely convinced that the worldview's proposal as it is does justice to that aspect, and that's part of the concern when I'm reading that we're rejecting essentialized versions of the teaching of religion. So what is it all just everything's up for grabs? We're just a blank slate. We're all constructing and inventing whatever we want. And once you make that turn, then you're sort of diluting and watering down further the tradition. So those are some of the concerns that I have. And that document I think is still there as part of RE Online, to my knowledge. And I think that I'd like to certainly see that being tweaked or amended. That's not to say we would reject existentialist views. This is part of the critical realist pedagogy. There's epistemic relativity, there's space for different ideas and different views. People can hold that view, but then you can't say that for those in the room who may be coming from Christian or Muslim backgrounds or other religious points of view, that if they're looking at this and they're not taking an existentialist way of viewing this, seeing it as something that is, that has been essentialized, something that is fixed, that's something that's been passed down and handed on throughout the centuries. That's something we should be trying to preserve, I think, as RE practitioners, and we're wanting to keep space for that.
Mm. Yeah, sure. Krista, have you got any other thoughts on that or examples?
Well, I think anti-essentialism is really important. You raised some really good points there, Sav. Another thing is the desire to move away from quote unquote authoritative voices.
Yeah.
And so these are two things that are legitimate points of discussion amongst RE practitioners and theorists. And I think that to just land in the camp of anti-essentialism and land in the camp of anti-authoritarian voices, we really need to know what we mean by that.
Yeah.
So if we just say, anti-essentialism, there is no, there's 20,000 versions of what it means to be a Christian. Or, could we say the same about Islam? Would we say that, some people say it's important to believe and recite the Shahada, but some people don't. Some people believe that in Islam, Allah is unique and there is none like him. He has no associates. And so they believe in the sin of shirk. But other Muslims think that Allah is one of many gods. These things aren't consistent with, and they're not philosophically consistent. They're not consistent with the history of Islamic belief, for example. And so we can't get away from the idea that there simply are essentials of religious and non-religious traditions, and there are authoritarian, or sorry, not authoritarian, but authoritative voices, and perhaps that's a good distinction to make. Authoritarian presentations of religion versus getting to know what are the authoritative beliefs within those religions. But these are discussions that good theology and good philosophy has. And
Mm.
so I'm concerned that just kind of landing in a quote anti-essentialist or anti-authoritarian position on these things lacks a lot of nuance. It lacks a lot of discussion, and so I think there's just a lot more thinking needed to be done there.
Sure. And I guess we also need to consider that there are voices that are quite explicitly within the worldview camp that are wanting to secularize and bring humanism and other forms of non-religious belief to the same level, to in fact giving it statutory force. And I know that there are some amendments to the schools bill, the Children's Wellbeing in Schools bill, that are being tabled by Baroness Burt, who tried to bring her own private members bill on this matter to give that legislative backing. And I mean that's a whole other topic. I guess kind of maybe perhaps bringing this to a close, and I'll give you the opportunity to say anything you wanted to say that we've not touched on in a moment. But I guess we've talked a lot about the academic disciplines, about different pedagogical approaches in RE, about the current sort of movements within the RE world. But thinking very practically as a Christian, when you are in your classroom, when you are with your students, when you are fulfilling your professional duties, but you are also um, teaching, which what can often be a real gift. You're teaching the Bible, say in Christian theology or in the study of religion. How do you do that in a way that ensures you're navigating these responsibilities really well? How do you make the most of those opportunities without seeking to proselytize or put any pressure? I think that's something that could be quite challenging as a Christian teacher in RE.
Yeah, so we navigate between so my style is I tend to teach as facilitator. Here's a range of views, range of ideas. And what I like about the proposal from the joint proposal from REN and ISR says it's taking hermeneutics quite seriously as well, and the reading of text and grappling with that. I think that's important. Um, and obviously giving students the freedom to make up their own minds, but to say that seriously study this, read through. What do you think? Reading for comprehension,
Mhm.
trying to teach them to grapple with what are the texts saying. The exam boards are already geared towards this as well. So the fact that they often ask students to make references to sources of authority, sources of wisdom and authority. What I don't like, and this is something I wish all the exam boards at GCSE and A level would tweak, is they credit students in exams when they quote out of context. If it applies to an issue, it's
Okay.
one of my bugbears with the exam boards. They will still get the credit for it, and I think that's bad practice. I think that's an area for development for at GCSE and A level as well. Yes, it asks a lot of our students to read in context, but yes, we want to encourage students to be engaging with text and learning quotes and doing that. That's important, but to try and do it in a way that's constructive and helpful. So um, I try as best as I'm able to get students engaging with these texts as much as we can, encouraging them to make their own conclusions. Sometimes, and it takes discernment on my part to know when to step in and to go, that's not quite right, let's come back to this understanding. And other times to go, you're free to hold a different point of view on that. And that's sometimes not always easy to discern.
Mm.
I think, but part of the skill of being a practitioner in that environment is you're having to balance those different views. So, questions that are up for debate, compared to questions that aren't, there are some things that we really have to say, well, no, if you're coming out with rhetoric that's racist, we're going to need to have a conversation around that. Or if it's sexist, we need to talk about that. There's a degree of intolerance that we're going to have. And I think every institution, every teacher needs to see, where are we going to draw that line? So, um, yeah, I would encourage students to come to their own conclusions, to make, to grapple with these things themselves, but I'd want them to seriously engage with the texts as they've been passed on. I think that's one of the ways that we can move forward with that.
Sure. Cristo, what about you? Do your students know when you're teaching them that you are a Christian? Do they ever ask you about that?
Well, I've had such a kind of varied background doing lots of different roles in education. So, French and German teacher, I've been a chaplain and teaching religious education as well. And I think the most challenging place to speak about your own convictions is as a religious education teacher. As a
Mm.
French and German teacher, there's very little connection with my own personal faith and the curriculum. And so it's you have quite a bit of freedom to just say, yes, I'm a Christian, this is what I believe,
Sure.
should it come up. I think my approach is if we are so settled in our Christian identity and we're so settled in the truthfulness of Christianity, then that actually frees us from um, two things. One, wanting to kind of straw man other religious traditions or non-religious worldviews. That is presenting a weaker version um, of those traditions or worldviews, and then also preventing us from creating a steel man of Christianity, as in giving all the best arguments for Christianity and never giving any nuance and never giving any counterpoints. My belief is that Christianity is true, and therefore I can present all religions in their strongest points and criticism worldviews, and I can present Christianity in its strongest points and present against it. And I tend to use scholars in the field as interlocutors. So it's not, this is my view with the students. This is a scholar from this university in the UK. Let's say when we're doing creation, we're looking at Dennis Alexander and Andy McIntosh, one at Leeds, one at the Faraday Institute. And they share, the students orientate their views and thinking towards those two scholarly representatives of those positions. And in Sav's words, I'm more of a facilitator. So two things. One, confidence that Christianity is ultimately true brings you a freedom to teach everything well. And then the other thing is using scholars as the interlocutors, the points of connection, rather than our own personal views as teachers. And I found that actually, it really opens you up. And I really enjoy writing curriculum and teaching things that I don't necessarily agree with, because my ultimate goal, and perhaps this speaks to the whole point of this podcast, is to have students to think and to think about what is true. And if Christianity is true, we don't have to be afraid at all of teaching really, really good, high quality Islam, where we're reading parts of the Quran, we're reading the Hadith, we're looking at the traditions, we're being very, very faithful to what Muslims would believe and teach about those things, because we have the confidence that ultimately students are going to make their own decisions. And I think that's a really helpful way of perceiving it. And it's something that gives me personal integrity, where I can hold my Christian beliefs, but also as an educator, I'm free to teach very, very well.
That's brilliant. Absolutely.
That's really good. I don't know, I'm looking, I might have this wrong, that you've got some books behind you, Lizzie, but one of them, it brought to mind, it might not be this book, but there's a book by, I think it's James Fowler, Stages of Faith. And I remember back in my days at LST, they were saying one of the things that you do as a student when you go to somewhere like LST is it nudges you through one of the stages, which is going through this process of subject your beliefs to scrutiny. And once you go through that point, you move to the next stage, which is, I think this is partly what Cristo was just articulating. You don't need to feel threatened then with exploring different points of view. And I try to articulate that with all of my students, that this is a really worthwhile, valid exercise. This is how historically we've always got closer to the truth. We have space for different views. I'm a classical liberal in that sense, but as a Christian, I don't have to in any way feel threatened by that. I've been teaching for over 15 years. I've heard it all. I'm sure there are going to be some surprises out there, but yeah, Christian, I find it's robust and good enough to be able to withstand the scrutiny. So you don't need to feel in any way threatened by that, I think. And it's good as well, having that hospitality and openness to want to better understand where other people are coming from. That's a good thing as well. And it's good to recognize that as well. I don't think people are always willing to acknowledge that being neutral is a myth, even if you're someone who says you're non-religious, that we're all putting forward an agenda. And I even think maybe some of that might have been meshed in with the whole worldview stuff. They were attempting to maintain neutrality, but it's not possible. It's a myth. We're always presenting some sort of agenda here. We're all making truth claims. It's just important we spend some time thinking those through carefully, listening to one another in a spirit of respect towards each other as well, but also taking seriously what I believe and giving each other the dignity of difference to be able to explore that and to be heard and to be understood. So yeah, that's where I come from. It's really, really good. It's really great fun. And there's a rich tradition as well. When we look at these scholars and the using them as interlocutors, as Cristo was saying, I think there's so much out there. But it's just we're having to I'm finding we're having to fight or work harder to get students to that point, weighing them off social media and looking at things for 3 seconds, try and stick with the text, read it for yourself. Don't over rely on AI. That's the next big challenge.
Yeah.
There's a good conference coming up in September, isn't there, Lizzie, to do
Oh,
with
there is. Oh, funny you mentioned that. Yeah. The Imago
yeah.
Day, the ACT conference,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there's a really good book by John Lennox, who's going to be one of the speakers on 2084 and the AI revolution. Yeah, so it's important, depth is important. Coming back to Portia's point, a little learning is a dangerous thing. I think taking the text seriously, grappling deep with text, the reading, it's all incredibly helpful for high quality ARI, I think.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much. If there are any resources that you would like us to share, I mean, it sounds like we've got loads of books that I'm going to have to list in this description, but
I'm going to send it. There's one other thing as well. I wanted to give a plug because I'm also a trustee for Solus.
yeah,
And there's a few really good resources that have come out. There's the book by Andy Bannister, and let me get it was co-written, wasn't it? Matthews, Have You Ever Wondered? It's a collection of really short chapters, really good to use in the classroom, for anyone who wants to make use of that, get students thinking. You could build a curriculum around that. And Andy Bannister's recently republished his revised edition of The Atheist Who Didn't Exist. Again, it's geared towards a younger audience, so that's another really good resource to get people thinking in the classroom, for those who want to use that. And there's lots of stuff on the Solus website. I'm sure I can share the link. We're in a discussion actually about trying to organize some of their clips so that they're more tailored to our exam classes. So if people are looking for clips around, I don't know, pluralism or God's existence, or can we take the Bible seriously, that would be one place that people can go to use. And there's going to be clips that they can engage with to look at in the classroom as well. So those are some of those things that I'd suggest.
brilliant. And Cristo, I think you're also developing something very similar with Ocker, aren't you?
Yeah, so we have a few School Thinking Day, which is an event in school that will be open to any school with a religious character or not, where we present the Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and we invite speakers from other faiths and worldview. That's a Critical Thinking Day. That'll be coming up on our website shortly. And also Thinking Faith Day, where we're talking about the Christian faith more kind of strongly for schools with a faith background. But yeah, so I think that's I probably would recommend a lot of the same resources as Sav, so I'll leave that to Sav.
I'd
Great.
also add, joining a network I found incredibly beneficial, particularly when I was head of department and I was experiencing a lot of pushback. They were wanting to go down just the abstract philosophy route, and I found being part of a network helped me to keep perspective outside of the school bubble and to see what was going on at the national level. And I found that incredibly formative and helpful. So to anyone listening to this, joining a subject specific network, and REN, ISRSA, you don't have to be in the independent sector to join that. Those are really good networks to be involved in and to get support. And they do really, really good conferences as well. So I've been going along to those of the ISRSA. The next one's at Eton as well. I know that in the past there was an issue around cost, which was in Oxford, but the next one's going to be at Eton, which is going to bring the cost of the conference down considerably. So that should be those should be really good things to get involved in for any teachers listening to this.
Excellent. And I know that the Religious Education Network has also got events coming up, and yeah, watch this space, I think. So thank you both so much for your time. It's been really illuminating, a very complex subject, but one that has so much importance in the lives of students, and is also something that all students have to study at some point. Now, sadly, that doesn't always take place, but yeah, let's pray for RE teachers, and particularly Christian RE teachers, navigating this complex landscape. Thanks both so much.
Yeah.
Thank
Lizzie,
you
can
for
I
having
just
me.
say, just to end, anybody that's been listening to it that'd like to pick up a conversation, you can find my email address online. I'm happy to talk about that. I don't represent any of the institutions in this conversation, but I'm more than happy to talk about this to any listeners that wants to kind of pick this up. So thank you for the opportunity, Lizzie and Sav.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Absolutely. Always open to conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.